Paul Nichols never imagined that his greatest masterpiece would rise from the ashes of betrayal. A struggling artist in his late 30s, Paul's days were a blur of paint-streaked hands and endless sketches in their modest suburban home. His studio was both a sanctuary and a battleground, where dreams clashed with reality in the form of unpaid bills and blank canvases. His wife, Emily, once his muse and closest confidant, had grown increasingly distant. She was no longer the vibrant woman who had inspired his early work. Instead, she seemed consumed by her corporate job and an endless stream of networking events. Paul's art had always been his escape. While Emily scrolled through her phone with a tight smile or hurried off to another late-night meeting, he poured his frustrations into his work. Yet, despite his efforts, recognition eluded him. Art critics overlooked him, galleries dismissed his submissions, and potential buyers seemed blind to the passion embedded in his brushstrokes. Their marriage had been rocky for months, but Paul told himself it was just the ebb and flow of life. "She's stressed," he'd reason, convincing himself that her aloofness was nothing more than exhaustion. Yet doubts crept in like shadows, and with them, the nagging feeling that he was missing something. Emily's laughter, once a melody in their home, had become reserved for someone on the other end of her phone. Her perfume lingered longer when she returned from work dinners, and her wardrobe had inexplicably shifted to include dresses Paul had never seen before. One evening, Paul sat in his studio, staring at a blank canvas, the weight of his creative block pressing down on him. Emily was out again. "Meeting a client," she'd said, her tone dismissive. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway had been like a thunderclap, shaking the silence of their home. Paul's eyes flicked to the clock, 9:47 p.m. She hadn't even bothered to offer an estimate of when she'd be back. Unable to focus, Paul wandered into the living room and noticed her laptop on the coffee table. Normally, he respected her privacy, but tonight was different. Something gnawed at him, a deep, unrelenting suspicion that he couldn't ignore. His hands trembled as he opened the device, the glow of the screen illuminating his furrowed brow. The truth hit him like a freight train. There, in her email, was an exchange with a man named David, a client, or so it seemed at first glance. But the messages told a different story. They were flirtatious, intimate, and painfully clear. Words like, "Last night was incredible," and "I can't stop thinking about you," danced across the screen, each one a dagger to Paul's heart. The final blow came in the form of a photo, David's hand resting possessively on Emily's waist as they stood in front of a luxurious restaurant. She wore the red dress Paul had complimented just 2 weeks ago, the one she'd claimed was for a work event. Paul's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the world tilted around him. He felt like an intruder in his own life, peering into a reality he wasn't supposed to see. The woman he'd loved, who had once stood by his side through every failure and triumph, was sharing herself with someone else. For a long moment, Paul simply sat there, the glow of the screen casting an eerie light on his devastated expression. His hands clenched into fists, nails biting into his palms as rage bubbled beneath the surface. He wanted to scream, to smash the laptop, to call Emily and demand answers. But as the storm of emotions surged within him, a single, unexpected thought cut through the chaos. Channel it. Paul closed the laptop, his movements deliberate and controlled. He returned to his studio, the blank canvas before him no longer a source of frustration but a challenge. Picking up a brush, he dipped it into a palette of dark, brooding colors, deep reds, inky blacks, and stormy grays. With every stroke, he poured his anguish onto the canvas, transforming his pain into art. The brush moved with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years, creating jagged lines and tortured shapes that mirrored the turmoil within him. Hours passed as Paul lost himself in the work. The first painting emerged like a scream frozen in time, a haunting depiction of a woman with a fractured face, her eyes hollow and unseeing. Around her swirled a chaotic storm of colors, symbolizing the betrayal that had upended Paul's world. He titled it, "Shattered Vows." As dawn broke, Paul stepped back from the canvas, his body aching and his mind numb. But for the first time in months, he felt something other than despair. This was more than a painting. It was a raw, unfiltered expression of his pain, a cathartic release that reignited his passion for his craft. Paul knew then that this was only the beginning. Emily's betrayal had cracked something open within him, and he would not waste the opportunity to turn his heartbreak into something extraordinary. He would create a series, a collection that captured the full spectrum of his emotions, from anger and sorrow to resilience and hope. And when the time was right, he would unveil it to the world. Paul's studio became a sanctuary, though it was filled not with calm but with a storm of emotions. Days turned into weeks as he buried himself in the creation of his series, the rhythm of his brushstrokes matching the chaotic beating of his heart. He hardly ate, his meals often forgotten on the edge of his workbench, and sleep came only in fleeting bursts. His paintings began to multiply, each one a chapter of the story he could never tell aloud. The second painting in the series, titled The Mask, depicted a figure cloaked in shimmering gold, their face split between a joyful facade and the agony hidden beneath. The dichotomy reflected Emily's deceit, her laughter and affection toward him now revealed to be a performance masking the betrayal. Paul used sharp contrasts to show the cracks in the veneer, each line cutting into the canvas as deeply as Emily's lies had carved into his soul. Even as the work consumed him, Paul couldn't help but notice the little things Emily continued to do to maintain her illusion of innocence. She came home late, always with an excuse, though the details of her stories began to blur. She avoided his eyes at breakfast and spoke to him in half-hearted tones, as if guilt weighed her down but not enough to stop her. One evening, Paul sat in the living room with his sketchbook, pretending to jot down idle ideas. Emily, perched on the armchair, was scrolling through her phone, a small smile playing at her lips. Paul knew without looking that she was texting him. "Long night again tomorrow?" Paul asked, his voice steady. Emily barely glanced up. "Yeah. Big meeting. The client's pushing for last-minute revisions." Paul nodded, his pencil scratching softly across the page. "Don't work too hard." Her laugh was nervous, hollow. "I won't." As she turned her attention back to her phone, Paul sketched the scene before him. Emily, bathed in the soft glow of her screen, her features softened by the deceptive light. He added shadowy figures lurking in the background, faceless and menacing, representing the lies that bound her to someone else. That sketch would later become Whispers in the Dark, another piece in his growing collection. In the weeks that followed, Paul continued to create with an intensity that frightened even him. Each painting became more vivid, more visceral, as he channeled every ounce of his rage, sadness, and longing into the canvases. The series, which he began to call Betrayal Unveiled, was taking on a life of its own. The paintings told a story, a journey through pain, self-discovery, and eventually, liberation. The fourth painting, Echoes of a Lie, was a haunting depiction of a woman's silhouette, her features dissolving into smoke. Behind her, a pair of hands reached out, grasping but never connecting, their fingers clawing at the empty air. The work captured the fleeting moments when Paul had tried to hold on to Emily, to make sense of their crumbling relationship, only to realize there was nothing left to grasp. As the series grew, Paul began to consider the possibility of sharing it with the world. For years he had been rejected by galleries, his work dismissed as too introspective or unconventional. But Betrayal Unveiled was different. It was raw, emotional, and deeply personal, a reflection of his soul laid bare for anyone brave enough to look. He believed it might finally be the work that earned him the recognition he'd always craved. One day, as Emily prepared for another late-night meeting, Paul couldn't help but notice her choice of attire. She wore a sleek black dress that clung to her figure, paired with heels that clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. It was a far cry from the casual outfits she used to wear to her supposed work events. "You look nice," Paul said, carefully neutral. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "Thanks. It's a big night." Paul nodded, his expression unreadable. "Have fun." As she walked out the door, Paul allowed himself a bitter smile. He had already begun researching gallery spaces and networking with curators. If everything went according to plan, Betrayal Unveiled would be ready for its grand debut within a month. Emily wouldn't suspect a thing until it was too late. The sixth painting in the series, Silent Witness, was born that night. It depicted a figure seated at a table, their face obscured by a mask of gold. Around them, shadowy forms whispered and leered, their intentions dark and inscrutable. The figure's hands rested on the table, fingers curled into fists, their knuckles white with suppressed fury. Paul's inspiration was clear. It was his own silent suffering, his role as the unseen witness to Emily's betrayal. By the time Emily returned home, Paul was in his studio, putting the finishing touches on the painting. She poked her head in, her expression a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "You've been spending a lot of time in here lately," she said. Paul didn't look up. "Work's been flowing. Inspiration hit." "That's great," Emily said, her tone uncertain. She lingered in the doorway for a moment before retreating to their bedroom. Paul waited until he heard the sound of the shower before stepping back from the canvas. He stared at the painting, his chest heaving with the effort of containing his emotions. The series was nearly complete, but the most important piece, the centerpiece of the collection, still eluded him. He needed something that captured the entirety of his experience. The love that had once burned so brightly, the betrayal that had extinguished it, and the quiet determination that now fueled him. It would be his final masterpiece, the culmination of months of anguish and artistic triumph. As he gazed at the unfinished sketch on his easel, an idea began to take shape, a piece that would not only expose the truth but immortalize it. The final painting in Paul's series haunted him. The idea had simmered in his mind for weeks, teasing him with fragments of imagery, but it refused to solidify. It wasn't just another piece of art, it would be the heart of Betrayal Unveiled, the one that tied the entire collection together. It needed to encapsulate everything, the love that once burned brightly, the cold reality of Emily's infidelity, and the fragile hope of a life rebuilt from the wreckage. Paul's sleepless nights grew longer as he wrestled with the concept. The studio became a vortex of chaos, with discarded sketches and splashes of paint littering every surface. He worked obsessively, refusing to leave until the vision crystallized. And then, one night, as he stared at the blank canvas under the flickering light of a single desk lamp, it came to him. The image was sharp in his mind, a woman standing on a crumbling pedestal, her form illuminated by a harsh spotlight. Her face was fractured, pieces of her features breaking away and scattering into the darkness like shards of glass. Behind her loomed a shadowy figure, a man whose features were obscured, his hands holding the strings of a marionette. Around them, an audience of faceless onlookers stood in judgment, their eyes glowing with accusation. Paul titled it, "The Puppet and Her Master." It was a deliberate and ruthless statement, one that captured both the betrayal and its architect. The woman was Emily, her pedestal representing the facade of their marriage, now crumbling under the weight of deceit. The shadowy figure pulling the strings was David, her lover, a man who had turned her into a pawn in his game of seduction. And the faceless crowd? They were the world, witnesses to a truth too raw to ignore. Paul's brush moved with a precision born of clarity. Every stroke was infused with purpose, every color carefully chosen. He used muted tones to convey the coldness of betrayal, sharp contrasts to highlight the fracture lines in the woman's face, and deep, fiery reds to signify the anger and passion simmering beneath the surface. The background was a swirling void of dark grays and blacks, drawing the viewer's eye inexorably toward the central figures. The work took days to complete. Paul rarely left the studio, sustained by little more than coffee and determination. Emily, oblivious to his efforts, continued her charade, slipping in and out of the house with vague explanations for her absences. She barely noticed Paul's growing distance, chalking it up to his obsession with his art. When the painting was finally finished, Paul stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. It was everything he had imagined and more, a brutal, honest portrayal of his pain and the deception that had fueled it. He stared at the canvas, feeling a strange mix of triumph and sadness. This was his masterpiece, but it had come at a cost he could never have foreseen. With the series complete, Paul turned his attention to the next step, finding a gallery willing to exhibit the collection. He reached out to contacts, cold-called curators, and sent digital portfolios to dozens of galleries across the city. For weeks, he heard nothing but polite rejections and radio silence. The series was too raw, too personal, too unorthodox for the commercial art world. Then, a breakthrough came. Paul received a call from Sarah Weaver, a young and ambitious gallery owner who had recently gained attention for showcasing provocative, boundary-pushing art. Sarah had seen his portfolio and was captivated by the emotional intensity of Betrayal Unveiled. She invited Paul to meet her at her gallery, Echelon Art Space, to discuss a potential collaboration. The gallery was a modern, minimalist space with sleek white walls and polished concrete floors. Sarah greeted Paul with a warm smile and an eager handshake, her short blonde hair and oversized glasses giving her an air of creative authority. As they walked through the gallery, she explained her vision. "Your work is unlike anything I've seen," Sarah said, her voice filled with admiration. "It's raw and unfiltered, but there's a universal truth in it. Everyone has experienced betrayal in some form, and your art captures that in a way that's both beautiful and devastating." Paul felt a flicker of hope as Sarah continued. She wanted to feature Betrayal Unveiled as the centerpiece of an upcoming exhibit titled The Art of Emotion. The event would be well publicized, attracting critics, collectors, and art enthusiasts from across the city. It was an opportunity Paul couldn't refuse. "Thank you," Paul said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "This work is deeply personal, and I want it to make an impact." "It will," Sarah assured him. "This series is going to turn heads, Paul. It's going to make people talk." Over the following weeks, Paul worked tirelessly to prepare for the exhibition. He collaborated with Sarah on the curation, carefully selecting the order in which the paintings would be displayed. Each piece was positioned to guide viewers through the journey of Betrayal Unveiled, from the initial cracks in the relationship to the shattering betrayal and the final act of defiance. The centerpiece, the puppet and her master, would be unveiled last, a dramatic climax to the narrative. Paul insisted on one particular detail. The unveiling would be a live event, with a cloth draped over the painting until the moment was right. He wanted the impact to be immediate, the reaction visceral. As the date of the exhibition approached, Paul sent Emily an invitation, careful to mask his true intentions. He told her it was a celebration of his latest work, a culmination of months of effort. She accepted without hesitation, clearly relieved that Paul seemed to have found a distraction from his suspicions. "I'm proud of you," she said, handing the invitation back to him with a smile. "This is a big deal." Paul returned the smile, though his eyes betrayed none of the storm brewing within. "It is," he agreed. "It's going to be unforgettable." The evening of the exhibition arrived with a crisp chill in the air. The city buzzed as art enthusiasts, critics, and collectors gathered at Echelon Art Space. The gallery had transformed into a beacon of light and elegance, its minimalist aesthetic complementing the raw emotion of Paul's series. Outside, a line of guests stretched along the sidewalk, their murmured anticipation adding a hum of energy to the event. Inside, Paul stood near the entrance, wearing a dark suit that offset the paint still faintly embedded under his nails. He welcomed guests with a polite smile, his nerves carefully concealed beneath a calm exterior. This was his moment, a chance to not only share his work but to expose the truth that had fueled it. Among the arriving guests was Emily, her hand tucked into the crook of David's arm. She was radiant in an emerald dress, her laughter ringing out as they entered. David, ever the charmer, exuded confidence as he exchanged greetings with other attendees. Neither of them noticed Paul watching from the shadows, his jaw tight as he observed the pair. The gallery was arranged like a maze, each section dedicated to a piece from Paul's series. Guests moved through the space in hushed awe, their expressions shifting as they took in each painting. The first section was titled Illusions. Here, paintings like The Mask and Whispers in the Dark set the tone, portraying the early stages of deception. Attendees lingered, discussing the intricate details, the fractured expressions, the haunting use of shadow and light. Paul caught snippets of their conversations, words like haunting, visceral, and unsettling filling the air. As guests moved deeper into the gallery, the tone of the paintings shifted. The second section, Revelations, featured works like Shattered Vows and Echoes of a Lie. These pieces were more chaotic, the brushstrokes wild and unrestrained, mirroring the emotional turmoil of betrayal. Paul could see the impact on the audience: wide eyes, whispered exclamations, and even the occasional glistening tear. Emily and David navigated the gallery with practiced detachment, their faces betraying none of the emotions Paul had hoped to elicit. Emily, ever the pragmatist, offered polite smiles to fellow attendees, while David feigned interest in the art, nodding occasionally at pieces he barely glanced at. Paul knew it was only a matter of time before they reached the centerpiece. The final section of the gallery was shrouded in a palpable tension. A large curtain dominated the space, concealing the puppet and her master. Guests whispered excitedly, their curiosity building with each passing moment. Sarah Weaver stepped forward, microphone in hand, her voice cutting through the buzz of the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for the debut of Paul Nichols' extraordinary series, Betrayal Unveiled. This collection is not just art, it's a journey through the depths of human emotion. And now, it's time to unveil the piece that lies at the heart of this narrative. The crowd fell silent as Sarah gestured toward Paul. He stepped forward, his heart pounding as he took the microphone. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for being here tonight, Paul began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within him. This series was born from a deeply personal place. Each piece tells a story, one that many of us have experienced in some form. But tonight, I want to share the truth behind it. Paul paused, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Emily and David. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and Paul saw the flicker of unease in Emily's expression. This final piece, he continued, gesturing to the curtain, represents the culmination of that story. It is a reflection of betrayal, of deceit, and of the strength it takes to confront the truth. Tonight, I dedicate it to everyone who has ever been hurt and found a way to turn their pain into power. With that, Paul stepped aside, signaling for Sarah to draw the curtain. The room seemed to hold its breath as the fabric slid away, revealing the puppet and her master. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the crowd as guests took in the haunting image. The fractured woman on the pedestal, her features unmistakably resembling Emily, was illuminated by a stark, unforgiving light. The shadowy marionette, its hands controlling her every move, bore just enough detail for David's smirking likeness to emerge. Around them, the faceless crowd seemed to leer in judgment, their glowing eyes a silent condemnation. Emily froze, her face draining of color as she stared at the painting. Beside her, David's confident veneer cracked, his expression shifting from confusion to horror. The murmurs in the room grew louder, guests whispering to one another as recognition spread. It's her, someone whispered. And him, another voice added. The weight of the exposure crashed down on Emily and David like a tidal wave. Emily's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. David took a step back, his shoulders stiff with tension, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Paul watched their reactions with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. This was the moment he had worked for, but it wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his narrative, about showing the world, and himself, that he could rise above the betrayal. As the crowd continued to buzz, Sarah stepped forward once more, her voice filled with excitement. This is truly a remarkable piece, one that will be remembered for years to come. We already have collectors expressing interest in acquiring the entire series. Paul nodded, accepting her congratulations as his gaze lingered on Emily and David. They stood frozen in the middle of the crowd, their shame now immortalized in the art world. The unveiling of The Puppet and Her Master sent shockwaves through the gallery. Critics, collectors, and art enthusiasts swarmed the centerpiece, their reactions a blend of admiration, curiosity, and whispered speculation. Flashing cameras captured every angle of the painting, while guests debated its meaning with growing fervor. Paul stood to the side, observing the scene with a detached calm. He'd expected the painting to provoke strong emotions, but the intensity of the response exceeded even his wildest dreams. People weren't just admiring the art, they were dissecting it, unraveling its secrets with a passion that bordered on obsession. Emily and David, however, were anything but composed. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her champagne glass, her pale face betraying her efforts to appear unfazed. She glanced at David, who had retreated to the corner of the room, his jaw clenched and his eyes darting nervously. "Is it just me?" a nearby guest murmured, loud enough for Emily to hear. "Or does that look a lot like her?" Emily stiffened, her pulse pounding in her ears. The gallery's flattering light had become harsh and unforgiving, illuminating every nuance of her expression. She turned sharply, hoping to escape the growing stares, but her path was blocked by a group of attendees eager to discuss the painting. "It's so raw," one of them said, gesturing toward the puppet and her master. "It captures something deeply personal. I wonder what inspired it." "Yes," another agreed, their gaze flicking to Emily. "It feels specific, doesn't it? Like a window into a real story." Emily forced a smile, her throat tight. "Artists draw from many influences," she said, her voice wavering. "It's likely symbolic." "Perhaps," the first guest replied, their tone speculative. "But it feels like more than symbolism. It feels real." Across the room, David's unease had transformed into simmering anger. He approached Paul with sharp, purposeful steps, his voice low and threatening as he spoke. "What the hell is this?" David demanded, his face inches from Paul's. Paul met his gaze without flinching. "It's art, David. You wouldn't understand. You think you're clever, don't you?" David hissed. "Dragging us into this circus. Do you know what you've done?" Paul's smile was cold. "I've done exactly what needed to be done. Exposed the truth." David's hands curled into fists, but before he could respond, a gallery attendant approached, interrupting the tense exchange. "Mr. Nichols, a word? There's interest in purchasing the collection." Paul nodded, dismissing David without another glance. "Excuse me," he said smoothly. "I have business to attend to." The attention surrounding Betrayal Unveiled only grew as the night went on. Guests crowded around Paul, praising his work and expressing admiration for his courage. For years, Paul had been overlooked and dismissed, his talent buried beneath the weight of rejection. Now, the validation was overwhelming, almost surreal. Among the many faces in the crowd was Sarah Weaver, her enthusiasm uncontainable. "Paul," she said, pulling him aside, "you've created something extraordinary. Do you realize what's happening here? Your work is transcending art, it's becoming a movement." Paul raised an eyebrow. "A movement?" Sarah nodded eagerly. "People aren't just reacting to the paintings, they're connecting with them on a deeply personal level. This isn't just about betrayal, it's about resilience, about taking control of your narrative. You're inspiring people." Paul considered her words, a flicker of pride warming his chest. "I didn't set out to start a movement," he admitted. "I just needed to express what I felt. That's what makes it powerful," Sarah replied. "It's authentic. And people can see that." Meanwhile, Emily had reached her breaking point. The whispers, the stares, the knowing glances, it was too much. She stormed out of the gallery, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. David followed, his frustration boiling over as he caught up to her outside. "This is a disaster," Emily snapped, her voice trembling. "Do you realize what he's done? We're a laughingstock." David's jaw tightened. "We can't let him get away with this." "And what do you suggest?" Emily shot back. "Confronting him only makes us look guiltier." David glanced back at the gallery, where the crowd continued to marvel at the paintings. "We need to find a way to control the narrative," he said, his voice low, "before it spirals any further." Emily's shoulders sagged as the weight of their predicament settled over her. "Good luck with that," she muttered, turning away. Inside, Paul remained at the center of the whirlwind. By the end of the evening, 3 collectors had made substantial offers on the series, each vying for the chance to own the story that had captivated the art world. Sarah, ever the shrewd negotiator, promised to secure the best deal for Paul, hinting that the series could fetch millions. As the gallery emptied and the buzz of the evening began to fade, Paul found himself alone with Sarah. She poured him a glass of wine, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You've done it, Paul," she said, raising her glass. "This is just the beginning." Paul clinked his glass against hers, the reality of his success finally sinking in. The pain that had driven him to create Betrayal Unveiled was still there, but now it was tempered by a sense of triumph. He had turned his heartbreak into something extraordinary, something that would outlive the people who had caused it. As he left the gallery that night, Paul felt a strange sense of closure. Emily and David might have stolen his trust, but he had taken back his power. And now, the world would remember them, not as lovers, but as the faces of betrayal, immortalized on his canvas. The days following the gallery event were a whirlwind of media attention and escalating interest in Betrayal Unveiled. News outlets raved about the collection, calling it a once-in-a-generation masterpiece, and lauding Paul as a rising star in the art world. Art blogs dissected the symbolism of the paintings, with the puppet and her master quickly becoming the focal point of the conversation. Critics speculated about the personal nature of the work, and online forums buzzed with theories about the identities of the figures in the centerpiece. Emily and David's lives, however, were unraveling at the seams. Emily avoided her office, unable to face the whispers and side glances from colleagues who had attended the exhibit. She spent her days holed up in her bedroom, scrolling through social media posts about the collection. Her name hadn't been publicly linked to the paintings, but the likeness in The Puppet and Her Master was undeniable to those who knew her. Friends had begun to send her awkward messages, their words teetering between sympathy and veiled accusation. David fared no better. His polished reputation as a suave professional took a nosedive after the exhibit. Though Paul hadn't explicitly named him in the work, whispers of his involvement spread quickly. Colleagues withdrew, clients canceled meetings, and even casual acquaintances avoided his calls. At one point, David stormed into Emily's apartment, his face flushed with anger. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to my career?" he demanded, slamming a newspaper onto the counter. The headline read, "A Scandal on Canvas, the story behind Paul Nichol's viral art series." Emily, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, shot him a glare. "You think this is just about you? My life is falling apart too, David." "Then fix it," he snapped. "Do some damage control. Talk to Paul, beg him to pull the collection, whatever it takes." Emily laughed bitterly. "Beg him? He's made it clear he's done with me. And let's not forget whose brilliant idea it was to keep things going when we could have stopped." David opened his mouth to retort but closed it just as quickly. He knew there was no point in arguing. The damage had been done, and there was no undoing the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, Paul's life had taken a dramatic turn. The series was sold in its entirety for $6.2 million to an international collector. The deal was brokered by Sarah, whose negotiation skills secured not only the sale, but also a long-term partnership with Paul. His name now appeared in major art publications, and galleries across the world began reaching out to host future exhibitions of his work. With the money from the sale, Paul made several bold decisions. First, he sold the house he had shared with Emily, leaving behind the ghosts of their broken marriage. The proceeds went toward a sleek new studio in the heart of the city, a space that symbolized his rebirth as an artist. He also donated a portion of his earnings to organizations supporting struggling artists, wanting to give back to the community that had once felt out of reach. But most importantly, Paul began to plan for his future, a future free from the shadows of Emily's betrayal. One afternoon, Sarah called Paul with an unexpected update. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her tone tinged with amusement. "The collector who bought Betrayal unveiled plans to loan the series to a museum for a special exhibit." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Which museum?" "The National Gallery of Modern Art," Sarah replied. It's a huge honor. They want to showcase it as part of an exhibit on contemporary storytelling in art. Paul felt a mix of pride and irony. The collection that had emerged from his heartbreak would now stand in one of the world's most prestigious institutions, viewed by thousands of people. Emily and David, immortalized in the art world, would have their betrayal laid bare on an even grander scale. The exhibit's announcement sent ripples through the art community, reigniting interest in the series. Articles surfaced speculating about the identities behind The Puppet and Her Master, with several outlets piecing together clues that pointed squarely at Emily and David. Though Paul had never confirmed or denied the connection, the mounting evidence made it impossible to ignore. Emily, desperate to regain control of her narrative, reached out to Paul for the first time since the gallery event. She called late one evening, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Paul, it's me. Can we talk?" Paul hesitated, his fingers tightening around the phone. "What is there to talk about, Emily? I need to explain," she said, her words tumbling over each other. "What happened, what I did, it wasn't because of you. It was my own weakness, my own mistake." Paul's jaw clenched, the familiar ache of betrayal stirring in his chest. "Emily, I don't need your explanations. I've moved on. Please," she pleaded. "This exhibit, it's ruining me. Everyone knows it's me. I'm begging you, Paul. Pull it. Destroy it if you have to." Paul closed his eyes, his voice steady as he replied. "I didn't ruin you, Emily. You did that yourself. My work isn't about revenge, it's about truth. And I won't apologize for sharing mine." The line went silent, save for Emily's shaky breathing. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry," before hanging up. For Paul, the conversation was cathartic. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed to hear those words from Emily, even if they came far too late. As he set down the phone, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had taken his pain and turned it into something beautiful, something that resonated with people far beyond his own experience. He was no longer a struggling artist. He was a storyteller, a creator, and above all, a survivor. The National Gallery of Modern Art unveiled, Betrayal unveiled, with unparalleled fanfare. The collection, already a sensation, was elevated to a cultural phenomenon. The exhibit attracted art critics, journalists, and an international audience eager to witness the series that had sparked such intrigue. It was no longer just art, it was a narrative woven into the fabric of public fascination. Paul attended the opening night as the guest of honor. Standing among luminaries of the art world, he felt a surreal sense of accomplishment. Cameras flashed, reporters clamored for interviews, and admirers approached him with heartfelt gratitude for his work. "You've captured something so universal," one guest said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your series doesn't just tell a story, it tells our stories. It's breathtaking." Paul accepted the praise with humility, though he couldn't help but feel a twinge of irony. His pain, once so isolating, had become a bridge connecting him to others. Meanwhile, Emily and David were drowning in the aftermath of their exposure. The exhibit's announcement had reignited public scrutiny, with tabloids speculating endlessly about their connection to the series. Emily, once a rising star in her field, was quietly let go from her firm. The whispers in the office, the sidelong glances, and the tension among clients had made her presence untenable. David's reputation fared no better. His name became synonymous with betrayal in professional circles, and his career as a polished executive took a devastating hit. Business partners distanced themselves, citing a conflict of values, and his once thriving network evaporated overnight. Even their personal lives weren't spared. Mutual friends withdrew, uncomfortable with the association, while family members voiced their disappointment in hushed tones. Emily's parents, who had adored Paul, expressed their shame bluntly, leaving Emily to bear the brunt of their disapproval. The exhibit itself became an inescapable reminder of their downfall. Social media buzzed with photos of the series, with "The Puppet and Her Master" dominating discussions. Memes emerged, some mocking the figures in the painting, others praising Paul's audacity. Emily tried to avoid the coverage, but it was impossible to escape. Her face, though abstracted in the painting, was plastered across countless articles and posts. The image became iconic, a symbol of betrayal and its consequences. David, on the other hand, sought refuge in anger. He raged about Paul's exploitation, and even consulted a lawyer to explore legal action. But without explicit names or details linking him to the work, his efforts proved futile. "Face it, David," Emily said bitterly during one of their many arguments. "We made this mess, and now we're stuck in it." David glared at her, his jaw tight. "You don't think he planned this from the start? He wanted to ruin us." Emily laughed hollowly. "You don't need a mastermind to ruin people who've already ruined themselves." As the exhibit continued to draw record crowds, Paul found himself in a position he had never anticipated, wielding influence. Galleries clamored for his next collection, and art dealers offered lucrative commissions. He received invitations to speak at universities and conferences, with audiences eager to hear his thoughts on turning personal pain into creative triumph. But Paul was cautious. He knew that the success of Betrayal Unveiled was as much about timing and authenticity as it was about skill. He wasn't interested in becoming a betrayal artist or capitalizing on his past. Instead, he focused on creating work that reflected his growth and the resilience he had discovered within himself. One evening, Paul visited the National Gallery after hours, accompanied by Sarah. The two walked through the exhibit in silence, the empty halls amplifying the impact of the paintings. "I knew this series would be big," Sarah said, her voice reverent. "But it's history, Paul. You've changed the way people think about art. About vulnerability. About storytelling." Paul gazed at the puppet and her master, his expression unreadable. "It's strange," he said after a moment. "When I was painting this, I felt like I was tearing myself apart just to get the truth onto the canvas. Now, looking at it, it feels like it belongs to someone else." "It belongs to everyone now," Sarah replied. "That's what makes it timeless." As the exhibit's final days approached, the National Gallery announced a panel discussion featuring Paul. The event, streamed live, drew thousands of viewers eager to hear the artist's thoughts. Paul spoke candidly about the series, his creative process, and the catharsis of turning pain into beauty. During the Q&A session, a young woman in the audience stood to ask a question. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "Your work helped me leave a toxic relationship," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "It gave me the courage to face my truth. How does it feel to know that your pain has helped so many people?" Paul paused, the weight of her words settling over him. "It feels humbling," he said finally. "When I started this series, I was just trying to make sense of my own heartbreak. To know it's resonated with others, that it's given them strength, that's more than I could have ever hoped for." The audience erupted in applause, their admiration palpable. Later that evening, Paul returned to his new studio, the quiet space a stark contrast to the clamor of the gallery. He poured himself a glass of wine and stood before a blank canvas, his mind teeming with ideas. The chapter of betrayal was over, but his journey as an artist was just beginning. For the first time in years, Paul felt truly free, free to create, to dream, and to build a life unburdened by the past. As he lifted his brush and made the first stroke, he smiled. This was his canvas now, and he was finally in control. Months after the exhibition, the buzz around Betrayal Unveiled had yet to fade. The collection continued to tour prestigious galleries worldwide, from New York to Paris to Tokyo. Critics hailed Paul Nichols as a master of modern storytelling, a rare artist whose work bridged the gap between raw emotion and universal truth. But for Paul, the true victory wasn't the fame or fortune, it was the freedom to start anew. Emily's life, however, remained in shambles. Her attempts to rebuild her career had been met with polite rejection. Former colleagues, once eager to associate with her, now treated her as a pariah. The weight of public shame became unbearable, and Emily moved to a small coastal town, hoping for anonymity. But no matter where she went, the shadow of Betrayal Unveiled followed her. prints of the series adorned coffee shop walls, hotel lobbies, and even magazine covers. Tourists often whispered about the infamous painting, speculating about the identities of the figures. Every mention was a reminder of her role in the story, a cautionary tale immortalized on canvas. David's downfall was equally stark. Stripped of his professional reputation, he retreated into obscurity, bitter and resentful. He spent hours scouring the internet for discussions about the series, fuming at the persistent speculation tying him to the puppet and her master. Despite his attempts to move on, the painting's influence haunted him, its reach growing with each passing day. At a low point, David attempted to contact Paul, demanding an apology and threatening legal action. Paul's response was simple: silence. David's words went unanswered, his threats powerless against the artist's rising legacy. For Paul, life flourished in ways he could never have imagined. The proceeds from Betrayal Unveiled allowed him to focus solely on his art, unburdened by financial struggles. His new studio became a hub of creativity, its walls adorned with works in progress that spoke of hope, resilience, and reinvention. One of his most ambitious projects was a mentorship program for young artists. Drawing on his own struggles, Paul created a space where others could find their voices and tell their stories. The program gained recognition for nurturing raw talent, with many of its participants going on to exhibit their own work. "You've turned something painful into something beautiful," Sarah told him during one of their meetings. "That's the mark of a true artist." Years passed, and Betrayal Unveiled became a cornerstone of modern art history. Art schools dissected its themes, students wrote essays about its cultural impact, and its influence could be seen in countless other works. The painting's notoriety only grew when a documentary about Paul's life was released, chronicling his journey from heartbreak to artistic triumph. The film, titled Canvas of Resilience, premiered to critical acclaim. Interviews with Paul, Sarah, and even some of the exhibit's attendees painted a vivid picture of how one man's pain had sparked a global conversation. Though Emily declined to participate, her silence only fueled speculation, ensuring that her connection to the series remained a topic of fascination. On the 5-year anniversary of Betrayal Unveiled, the National Gallery held a retrospective in Paul's honor. The event drew an international crowd, with collectors, critics, and admirers traveling from across the globe to celebrate his work. Paul stood before the crowd, now a seasoned figure in the art world, his once frail confidence replaced by quiet strength. As he spoke, his words carried the weight of experience. "This series began as a way for me to process something deeply personal," Paul said, his voice steady. "But over time, it became so much more. It became a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to create, to heal, and to transform." The audience erupted in applause, their admiration for Paul as much about his resilience as his art. As the evening wound down, Paul lingered in front of the puppet and her master. The painting, now framed in glass and mounted with reverence, still held the same haunting power it had when he first created it. But instead of anger or sorrow, Paul felt only peace. He turned to Sarah, who stood beside him. "Do you think it'll always be like this?" he asked. "What do you mean?" she replied. "This weight," Paul said, gesturing to the painting. "Will it always define me?" Sarah considered his question before answering. "It'll always be part of your story," she said. "But it doesn't define who you are now. You've grown far beyond it, Paul. And that's what people will remember." That night, Paul returned to his studio, the city lights twinkling outside his window. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat before a blank canvas, the hum of possibility filling the room. As he lifted his brush, Paul smiled. His story was no longer one of betrayal, it was one of reinvention, of transformation, of hope. And this next chapter would be his masterpiece.